Hello and welcome to the CA Show for the CEO Magazine. I'm your host, Nick Vaidya. It is my distinct pleasure to bring to you one of the most prominent yoga researchers in the world, Dr. Khalsa from Harvard Medical School. Yoga is not like the other alternative medicine that have been debunked by many academics. Dr. Khalsa is a yoga practitioner and a researcher. Now that may lead some amongst us to think of possible biases in his work, but those familiar with the academic world can tell you that this is really not possible in this type of investigation. Listening to him, you will realize that yoga is not just a routine. It does have almost magical benefits, as you will recognize by the end of the conversation. Indeed, all of it is not yet validated, but there is enough evidence for everybody to get started and literally transform one's life, physically, mentally, and emotionally. You do indeed become a better person with yoga lifestyle. If you need scientific validation before you can be convinced of getting onto the yoga mat or in meditation, please take time to view this video. After listening to Dr. Kalsa, there will be very little doubt that yoga practice is more powerful than any other regimen. How much it can change your life remains to be understood properly, but it is clear that yoga needs to be a part of our daily ritual, just like brushing and bathing. So here is Dr. Khalsa for you. Alternative medicine has been debunked by Dr. Ernst, and I really don't have a good sense of whether he's right or wrong. There's some meta-analytic studies, but not having evidence is not the same thing as things not being true. Just because certain studies have not been done doesn't mean a certain phenomena doesn't exist. So we leave it at that. But I know that there are a lot of studies that you have looked at from yoga helping in instant results, where you see 20 minutes of yoga by the Illinois study that shows 20 minutes of yoga brings about learning improvement in boys. And there is this idea of your blood pressure and other indicators of health that improve from yoga. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, the issue with research, and particularly yoga research, is that yoga research is really in its infancy. This is a new area, especially yoga therapy research. The first yoga therapy studies that were ever done were not done until the early 1970s. So relative to other forms of therapy and pharmaceuticals, etc., yoga is really in its infancy. So as a consequence, any new field of research takes time. And that field of research usually starts without much funding. So as a consequence, a lot of the early studies are pilot studies, they're case studies, they have low sample size, there's no control groups. These are all preliminary trials just to show sort of basic proof of concept, just to get a sense of whether there's any hope of efficacy for these types of conditions. And so that's kind of more or less where we are at with yoga research. Now, there are some evolving trials, and it depends upon the specific area of yoga research that you're evaluating. Some areas are really very much in their infancy, and some have advanced much more. So it really is difficult to, at this point in time, come to these studies and write a meta-analysis, because there's simply not enough quality studies to then make a conclusion based upon a meta-analysis. And as you rightly pointed out, this does not mean that it doesn't work. It simply means that there's not enough research yet to say one way or the other. And with some critical meta-analytic reviewers, their conclusion at the end of the paper is that there's no justification for yoga to do this or that. And they portray the idea that it's been shown that yoga doesn't work, which is not the case. All they've shown is that there's not enough evidence at this point in time to demonstrate that yoga works. So that's the problem with these kinds of meta-analytic reviews happening so early in the field.
Now, meta-analysis, for the sake of the audience, is actually a statistical technique. It's not just a conceptual study of combining all the currently available statistical empirical evidence, but it is rather a statistical study where you put together and say, well, this particular phenomena exists or it doesn't exist, right?
Exactly. And it's not only that, it's not only statistical, but it also has very rigorous entry criteria. So for example, there may be 50 studies that have shown, just for the sake of argument, that yoga is good for headache. And then perhaps there's only 2 or 3 randomized controlled trials that show that yoga is good for headache. So in a meta-analytic study, you use entry criteria. You say, we're only going to evaluate those studies which were randomized controlled trials. So your meta-analysis starts to evaluate 3 papers. So immediately off the bat, you were already looking at a very small portion of what's out there in terms of what's been done so far. And as a consequence, your view is very skewed because you're only looking at those very few trials. So that's the problem with looking at this.
And I will say it, and I know you wouldn't, but I will venture to say that people who are using meta-analytic studies on yoga in this way are really not benefiting science, because there is a fundamental flaw, and they have an axe to grind off, so to speak, because I find them, especially in the case of Dr. Ernst, that he's consistently attacking and taking a position and moving forward. And that is fine. As a researcher, as a scientist, you should do that, because somebody else will come up with the opposing ideas. And like in the legal system, you can then come to a conclusion. But at least the truth be told, meta-analysis is, the field is not ready for meta-analysis. It only happens when a lot of research has been done and the conclusions need to be drawn after all people have looked at from various facets.
Yeah, that's true. And I would say in yoga research, the only areas that really would warrant meta-analysis, meta-analytic review at this point in time would be studies on yoga stress, for example, and another booming area in yoga research is yoga for cancer patients, evaluating improvements in mood and stress and quality of life and well-being. And there are indeed a number of meta-analytic papers on yoga for cancer. So that is one area that it's appropriate. But in most other areas of yoga research, as you say, we're not quite there yet.
And it's interesting that you say about cancer. Just as a side note, I am going to be talking with a gentleman by the name Bhava Ram. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was a New York Times reporter or somebody who says that he treated his cancer through yoga primarily.
I see.
So we'll find out what he has to say. But what does the analytic study reveal for where you believe that meta-analytic studies have shown answers?
Well, I think the evidence is really quite compelling that indeed yoga does improve perceived stress in cancer patients. It improves mood, improves quality of life and well-being. And that's not surprising. And the target of yoga research for cancer, of course, is not to cure cancer. The target in yoga research is to improve quality of life and allow the cancer patients to cope with the diagnosis itself, with this life-threatening disease, and also to improve their quality of life as they go through therapy. So before surgery, after surgery, long-term follow-up, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the role of yoga in cancer patients, and it is quite effective at what it does.
Okay, so okay, that's good to clarify that at this point we're not looking at any long-term studies that are using yoga as treatment in any way.
Not at this point in time. I mean, however, if you understand sort of the physiology and the pathology of cancer, it's very important to have your stress hormones under control. There are a few studies now that show improvements in inflammatory response and immune function in cancer patients. And of course, if you're trying to reject the tumor, enhancing your immune function is a very supportive role.
Now, you said something about physiology and cellular physiology. Have there been any studies that indicate that yoga, and I'm using yoga as a generic term, can help change the brain structures or the chemical balances of the mind?
Yes, indeed. Now, a lot of these studies are not yoga per se. A lot of them are meditation studies. But of course, as you pointed out, meditation is a key component in traditional yoga practice. And let me add here that most researchers that study yoga are not studying just the postures or the exercises. They are studying typically a traditional form of yoga, which includes all of the major components, especially the meditative component, the mind-body awareness, as well as breathing techniques and the postures. So these techniques indeed have shown changes in brain activity and brain structure. So these brain imaging techniques are capable of looking at unique areas of the brain, at specific nuclei within the brain, and then determining the activity from moment to moment. In fact, you can look at a second-to-second basis in specific nuclei in the brain and see what's happening. And so what these studies have shown is that indeed meditation is a unique state of brain activity. It's associated with specific activation of specific areas of the brain. And then there's this phenomenon of brain plasticity, which is well known in the field of neuroscience, that the more you activate certain regions of the brain, the more real estate starts to be devoted to those areas of the brain. In other words, you can actually see structural changes in the brain in association with certain behavioral activities. Now, on the mundane level, if you become a juggler, for example, those areas of the brain that are involved in the juggling process get thicker and bigger. It's the same with meditation. Those areas of the brain that are involved in the control of attention, that's at the heart of the meditation practice, start to become enhanced. And as you activate those areas of the brain, there's connections within the brain that that work from those centers. So in other words, in the action of meditation, you're controlling attention, which is typically regulated in the frontal lobes. Now, the frontal lobes happen to have connections with the limbic system, which is essentially the emotional brain. So what you see in terms of structural changes is those attentional regions start to get stronger. And that correlates with improvements in the ability of these long-term meditators to actually meditate more effectively. And what you see also is that long-term meditators have more resilience, more emotion regulation. They're less prone to having mental health problems. And when you look at the emotional brain, in fact, in long-term meditators, this limbic system is actually shrunk down to some degree. So you actually see not only activity changes in the brain, and these can happen in a novice practitioner. Practicing for the first 10 minutes, you can see brain activity changes associated with meditation. And the longer this individual practices, the more you can see actual structural changes in the brain, in the regions of the brain that are associated with the behavioral benefits of meditation and yoga practice.
So let me reiterate this really clearly. So you're saying that the research is not just about self-report, perceptive self-report of and self-perception of effect from yoga, but you're talking about clear manifestation, physical manifestation of the effects of yoga.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of us who have practiced yoga for many years, we look at these results and we say, yeah, of course there's changes in brain activity. Of course you're going to see structural changes because we've experienced these changes. And the interesting point is that having the demonstration, having a picture, having an image from a brain scan that we can show to other scientists somehow tends to be more convincing. In other words, they're not willing to believe us, but they're more willing to believe the actual objective data. But in fact, the subjective data is just as real as the objective data. And that's especially the case for specific disorders like mental health disorders, where there is no real objective measure. There's no measures we have at this point that are really solid for determining the degree of depression or generalized anxiety disorder. These are usually evaluated with an interview or a self-report questionnaire. And indeed, we can see the self-report changes. And when there are markers for these that we can measure, I'm quite certain we'll see changes in those markers.
No, absolutely. And then I guess people have to recognize that science is not bereft of emotions or people's perceptions, and it takes time to change those. But it's important to recognize that in certain cases, we are more accepting of subjective measures when it comes from the Western scientific perspective, such as look at psychology, and study of psychology largely is based on subjective measures. There are only recently the changes have taken place in technology where now we are able to scan and know these things, but we are more accepting of ADHD diagnosis versus benefits of yoga simply because we don't want to agree to something that is not inherently acceptable because of cultural and other reasons. And so that is the case, but you're saying now we have these scientific measures. Now, the next level I wanted to get into is if you've seen these studies or people are seeing these studies demonstrating the benefits of yoga and meditation, even in, as you're saying, in initial phase. Do you see perceptions changing amongst average people, or is there a lot of ways to go?
I'm not sure of your question. You're asking about perception of the general public or
General public.
the general public. Well, I think what you're seeing in the general public is a rapid and virtually exponential increase in the prevalence of yoga practice, certainly in the United States where we've conducted these measures. So just to throw out some statistics, a recent journal that was commissioned by the Yoga Journal, and they've done this for a number of years now, showed that there are now 20 million practitioners of yoga in the United States. And in answer to a question on the survey, how many people had some interest in practicing, those that were not yet practicing, that was an additional 100 million. So we're talking about a substantial fraction of the population that's practicing. And this was reaffirmed by another survey from the Center for Disease Control, which has conducted surveys of alternative medicine use. So in 2002, the number of people practicing yoga for health benefits was 5.1%. 5 years later, the same survey showed that that had increased by 1% to 6.1%. And it was one of the 4 therapies that had shown the greatest increase in prevalence over that 5-year period. So it's not only popular, it's rapidly growing. And I believe the statistics from the most recent 2012 survey show that that number has increased to over 8%. So we're looking at a dramatic increase in the percentage of the population that's practicing yoga. Now, there's 2 things about this. One is that if you look at the demographic of who's practicing yoga from some of these surveys, it's clearly very skewed. It is about 75 to 80% women. It is pretty much middle age. It is people who are actually fairly well educated, and also people who have higher incomes. And then, of course, there's also demographic. It's mostly white practitioners, and it's localized in geographic regions of the United States. So it's really those individuals who have the knowledge and the access to about yoga to be able to practice it. And so the reason they're practicing it, and we've done a survey to evaluate reasons for practice. We did this study in Austin, Texas, with a group of yoga studios that had beginners yoga programs. And one of the major reasons for practice was stress management. And we know from the research evidence and from personal experiences that yoga is a very highly effective tool for stress management. And so people come to yoga practice because there are no other practices within our culture, within our society, for coping with stress. There simply aren't. Never have been. And so this recognition of yoga to fill that gap has been recognized by a substantial fraction of the population, and people are essentially voting with their feet. Now, to some degree, that drive in personal practice is driving the research. Anything that the population is doing in large numbers is now fodder for research. And so yoga research has been exploding in coordination and in parallel with this dramatic increase in the prevalence of yoga practice amongst the general public. And what we're showing is exactly what, not surprisingly, what the public is experiencing in these practices. And this is not a fad. This is not like Beetle boots that's going to come and go. This is a real skill, a real phenomenon. And it's biological in nature. It's not just a hobby. This is a real biological effect. And my colleague, Herbert Benson, who's been doing meditation research for many decades, coined the phrase many years ago of the relaxation response, which is a biological change in the mind and the body, which is the opposite of the stress response. And so basically, yoga induces this relaxation response, which is really responsible and at the core of yoga's benefit for managing stress and managing emotion. So that, to me, is what's really driving everything here. And I think it's extremely important because we as a society are undergoing a substantial amount of unmanaged stress. And the consequence of that, and the consequence of not having skills to cope with that, means that we're seeing epidemics in lifestyle diseases that are related to stress, deeply related to stress. So things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, depression, anxiety. So this is sort of the global picture of what's happening right at this point in time in history, is that we are moving into a 24/7 society. Everything's 24/7. As a consequence, everything's much more stressful. And we're moving into this phase without the skills to be able to cope with this added stress. And yoga just happens to be a mind-body intervention that's very good at coping with this. So that's why all of this is coming together at this point in time.
Very interesting, very interesting. So I wanted to take to the motivations behind yoga. As you said, it's a field. It's a practice that is evolving. People have experienced yoga and they found benefits. That's why the adoption of a phenomena is happening. Right? This is a phenomena. It's being adopted. It's growing at a high rate, primarily driven not by research but by people's experiences. And therefore, researchers are following because it's more possible to do research, first of all. Secondly, there is impetus, there is funding, and therefore we are seeing that the experiences are showing empirical evidence in the scientific community, and it feeds the people back again that this works. But really, only a few people are interested in the scientific studies and details. There is so much out there. You said it's in infancy, but there's plenty of research that demonstrates that it helps in ADHD, it helps in depression, it helps in diabetes, like you said, it helps in stress response, it helps in your joint-related problems, inflammatory problems. It helps in obesity. It helps in everywhere, pretty much. There has been one study or the other on a lot of commonly experienced health problems, from Alzheimer's to Parkinson's to everywhere. My understanding is whether the researchers are, shall we say, conclusive or not, because research it's not just one piece of research that makes a conclusion. People don't understand. It's not like when you see in the report, research report, or some kind of a newspaper article that says, such a study done by, University of Illinois or University of Boston, and claims this, and therefore it is the truth. No, one study does not make the truth. The way science progresses is multiple studies conclusively telling you the same thing from multiple angles. So one study doesn't mean, but all these things are happening, and all of them have been showing at this point positive effects. Is that a fair statement?
I would say yes, and I would say that the reason behind this is because, number one, that yoga is really a holistic practice. It affects pretty much all of the systems of the body. You've got meditation, which affects cognitive functioning and emotional functioning. You've got the breathing techniques, which affects cardiorespiratory function. You've got the physical postures, which affect the musculoskeletal system. And for those people who go beyond this, and so what is called a yoga lifestyle, where they really dedicate their life to, their whole lifestyle to yoga-based principles, they start to change their diet, they start to change their behaviors, and it becomes a whole lifestyle. So as a consequence, they're affecting virtually every system of the body. And one of the features of that is that they're improving the functioning of every system of the body, including the ability to cope with stress, including the ability in case of sports teams to resist injury, and in the case of so-called yoga therapy, where yoga is used for therapeutic interventions, for bringing the body back into a balance, into a health. So what happens in a disease like type 2 diabetes, you have glucose dysregulation. Yoga is affecting the factors that contribute to glucose regulation. They're bringing the body into a higher functioning level. And that really accounts for why yoga is effective as a therapy. It's working on improving the functionality of the body. So that's why it's such a global approach, and why virtually yoga works seemingly for everything.
And when you say body, you include the mind, our mental status.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let's get into the motivations behind which a variety of people will come into yoga, because people are different in so many ways. Motivations are different. Somebody might come into it because of a disease. Somebody might come into it because there's a natural proclivity towards, shall we say, emotive or spiritual growth. Yes. So there are different motivations. I wanted to ask you this question, which you talked about, the limbic mind, which controls your emotions, and the cognitive. I mean, I don't know as much as you do about the details of neuroscience, but the control of emotions and improvement of cognitive functions is something that we know is benefited. But when people a large group of people, when they would want to do yoga, who are not necessarily unhealthy, such as, average, not average, but typical successful executive. Most of these people who are intelligent and successful and earning good money typically tend to be more open-minded, more intelligent, and they're more willing to try new things if they knew, right? And that's why successful people try these things before the less, shall we say, effective people in the lifestyle. So my question is, can we talk about why yoga can make you more successful as an average human being, ignoring the health part?
Well, I mean, I think you can't really ignore the health part, because mind-body is an artificial distinction. In Western medicine and Western science even, we've sort of parceled out the mind here and the body there. And, so now we have psychiatry here and we have, internal medicine there. And it's really an artificial distinction, because there is no real barrier between the two. The two are intrinsically linked together. So if you improve physical health, that actually has a stress management component. It actually has an emotional regulation component. Now, in terms of functioning, in terms of being successful, you have to have a healthy body, you have to have a healthy mind. And the mind and body, if they're performing more optimally, you are going to be more successful, basically because you are a more capable human being. So this is essentially what yoga does. It makes you more capable in every realm of what it is to be a human being. Now, that's a global statement, but I believe it's true. And no matter what system you're talking about, I believe that yoga is going to have some positive benefit. So if you're talking about an executive, what does an executive need? An executive has to be able to cope with the stress of his job. He has to be able to communicate with others effectively. He's got to have good executive decision-making processes. He's got to be cognitively alert and functional. He's got to have his emotions under control. All of those facets. And a lot of those facets are really addressed with this practice of meditation. Meditation enhances your ability to control attention. Attention is at the core of virtually every cognitive activity. If you can't concentrate, if you can't focus, how can you possibly serve as an executive? In terms of higher functions, one of the deficits of functioning higher is the inability to cope with emotions and stress. So if you're somewhat emotionally immature and have difficulty managing emotions, that's going to interfere with your ability to make executive decisions. So it's not just a question of enhancing cognitive function, it's also a question of taking away dysfunctional emotional processes, which are actually absorbing all of your energy. People who don't have their emotions and their stress under control are spending a lot of their cognitive effort and activity just trying to stay alive and manage and cope with their life circumstances. How can you effectively then serve as a leading executive when you're actually coping with those problems? So removing those problems, getting those under control, actually allows more resources to be devoted to the kinds of activities that you need to be an effective executive. So it's working on two levels. It's working on enhancing those cognitive faculties that are important for the job, and it's removing those dysfunctional aspects of your behavior that are impairing your work in that realm.
Now, let's take Warren Buffett's example, right? Everybody was jumping onto the .com bandwagon. Warren Buffett decided not to do that. And in retrospect, it seems like, wow, he knew something that others didn't. It's a fundamental issue of perceiving things more clearly. Sometimes an emotionally less matured person might see a rope and say, that's a snake. Another person might say, wait, hang on, let me make sure it's a snake, and not respond that quickly to fight or flight. And how I perceive things obviously affects how I choose my next steps. And therefore, you find chief executives, incredibly successful chief executives, paid so highly because they are able to perceive things differently from the rest of the populace. And then, based on that perception, they're also secondarily able to make superior decisions, such as the case of Warren Buffett, or in the case of, let's say, Fold, the CEO of Lehman Brothers, right? He saw certain things that they're not right, something is not right with the financial crisis, something is going to happen, but chose not to act. Another CEO in that situation might have acted, and just that how you handle your perception influences your actions, which influences results. And at the highest levels, such as CEOs managing billions of dollars, or a pilot of an F-16 handling an expensive flight or aircraft, or a B-52 bomber, which is $1 billion aircraft, perceptions, actions, boom, financial crisis, or a B-52 going down. These are very, very important perceptions and decisions. So when we realize that, we all should recognize that it's incredibly important to improve your ability to perceive things, shall we say, more closer to the truth than otherwise, and therefore take actions accordingly. Does yoga help that in any way?
Yes, absolutely. And when you get into the philosophy of yoga and what starts to happen both biologically and behaviorally with yoga practice, you start to develop the faculty of actually seeing the world, as you have said, clearly, more accurately, less colored by your previous conceptions, your emotional inclination, et cetera, et cetera. And as a consequence, you're able to avoid decisions which are colored. And there's this analogy that we see the world through colored glasses. And those colored glasses are due to a lot of the, let's say, the dirt and the smog that's in front of us. And that smog is basically an emotional smog. It's from our past, it's from our upbringing, it's from our rigid conceptions, et cetera, et cetera. And when you engage in the state of
your natural proclivities, you have a personality, and there are traits that
everyone has different strengths and weaknesses in terms of their personalities, and some people have a burden and some people have an advantage. But in any case, regardless of your genetic predisposition or the personality that you happen to be benefited with, you can enhance your capabilities by engaging in this type of contemplative practice. Not only in terms of actual sort of mundane cognitive functioning, being more perceptive and more having a higher reaction time and seeing things more clearly and being less distracted. But as you practice yoga and meditation over the course of months and years, you start to activate areas of the brain that I believe are tapping into what we can talk about as sort of creativity. And you can enhance creativity. You can enhance sort of out-of-the-box thinking, because you start to break down the barriers that have been sort of set in place by your upbringing, your education, or whatever, societal beliefs, etc. And you start to be a bit more of a free thinker and thinking out of the box. And that is one of the characteristics that really defines someone who is at the top of his game. Many of the Nobel laureates in history have been out-of-the-box thinkers, who have been, have had the temerity to fight against the prevailing notions and challenge those notions and have the freedom of mind to challenge those notions. And I believe these types of contemplative practices really enhance the functioning of the brain in those regions that allow us to explore that and be a little bit more in the way of free thinkers.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm talking with, hopefully it'll work out, I don't know exactly when because the dates got changed, with the CEO of Aetna, who is a yoga practitioner, plus he's inculcated the practices in his organization, which is a huge organization, but also has a tremendous influence on the rest of the world, because Aetna is such a massive healthcare related company. And then Overstock.com CEO is also going to be on our show. And these are some of the things that I do want to discuss with them as to why you're doing it. And then when average people watch this, I'm hoping that they will recognize that there is reason to think about it. I mean, if you spend time reading the newspaper, if you spend time going to school, there's no reason why you shouldn't do this, because there is compelling evidence that your natural proclivities, your natural experiences, or your native experiences clutter your mind and dilute your ability to see things clearly and make decisions. People who have lived in situations where your perception and reaction come to fruition in a dramatic way, such as Air Force pilots, they can tell you stories, but average person working as an individual contributor in an organization can benefit tremendously from such practices, because they can not only, it's not just about creativity and innovation, because many people will say, well, in my average situation, I really don't have that scope. I'm a SKU manager. What do? I do analytics, or I do, SKU management through computer programs. But how you relate to people is influenced by that. How you look at opportunities is influenced by that. How you look at problems and how you handle them is handled by those capabilities. And the amount of improvement that you can see from yoga practices is, in my view, an incredible amount, depending upon how much you put in and then eventually get out of it. But most importantly, I believe that there is a fundamental misperception in the world that IQ is a huge contributor to success. And current research points out that is not the case. While, yes, you need a certain amount of IQ to succeed, but beyond that point, your success is not dependent upon IQ. The newer research talks about EQ, which to me fundamentally is what the Vedic, or from where the yoga has originally come out of, the Vedic thinking. EQ is your ability to manage yourself. Ability to manage yourself primarily depends upon how you manage your emotions, because your reactions to things are emotive, not cognitive. Well, some of them are cognitive, but at the base is your emotion, your passion, or whatever you may want to call it. But fundamental behaviors are driven by how we feel. Be it a negotiation situation, be it an average situation, any situation, how we feel pretty much determines how we act. And people may disagree, but it's a longer conversation. But they can find that, yes, how we feel is determining our behaviors. And if how we feel can be modified to your control, it's almost like genetically modifying yourself and saying, you know what, I choose this baby to be blue-eyed blonde, or whatever it is, we see in the movies. But here's an opportunity, not just blue-eyed blonde, but a person who is in control of his or her emotions and acts with steadfastness and therefore succeeds. You don't need tremendous amount of intelligence to be a successful CEO, but you do need tremendous amount of control over how you feel, because that is what drives your response. And what you just said is that how you feel can be controlled by yoga. Now, one other question to that extent is there research pointing out that how you feel can be controlled by yoga?
Absolutely. It's a strong area of research. And in fact, I think if I was to be asked what is the most robust outcome of a yoga intervention, it is basically stress management. It's the ability to cope with stress. It's the ability to cope with emotional reactivity. And that really is at the core of that. Now, that leads to everything else, because stress is in fact the largest risk factor for depression. It is a large risk factor for most of the other mental health conditions. So everything really leads from that. So the ability of yoga to manage stress is absolutely established as far as I'm concerned. It really is a no-brainer. And we just haven't seen the research that has brought it into practical circumstances. So, for example, yoga studies in corporate settings, there's very few of those. I've been involved in a couple of studies that were done in the UK. And of course, we're showing that there's improvements in mood, there's improvements in stress. And in fact, one of the things that was reported was improvements in low back pain. But I think as we move forward, not only will we show these improvements in stress and mood, and improvements in other stress-related conditions like headache or other stress-related complaints like insomnia, for example. We will also eventually see studies that show the improvement in productivity. I mean, in one sense, you're improving productivity by reducing absentee time, by decreasing absenteeism, but also by increasing presenteeism. Presenteeism is a term which refers to the fact, yes, they're at work, but are they productive? Are they actually at work? Are they actually working? And I think we're gonna see evidence in the future that yoga is capable of reducing absenteeism, enhancing presenteeism, and then enhancing all the other characteristics of being an employee, and that is interpersonal interactions, decision making, and actual attention control and commitment to the company, loyalty, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you're basically talking about a better work environment when you bring yoga in.
And when you say stress, stress is a way to stress is people's perception of stress may be different. So I just wanted to qualify what stress might mean. Stress is a measure of your current feelings. Now, we may perceive it as having physical manifestations or not, but fundamentally, it's how are you feeling at this moment? Is that correct?
Well, I would say feeling is more a sense of well-being and mood. Stress actually refers to the challenges you face and how you're able to cope with those life challenges. So you have X amount of work that needs to be done. You have X amount of family responsibilities that you need to fulfill. And if those are really challenging, you are under more stress. So let's take the example of a single mother. There's a stressful situation for you. This woman not only has to, feed the family, but also do this all by herself. So she's got to only be the breadwinner, but also the family caregiver. That's a stressful situation because of the amount of responsibilities. If that individual's incapable of coping with that and feels overwhelmed by this, that's when the actual consequences of that stress start to have negative impacts. And you start to see stress-related symptoms, things like headaches and insomnia, and anxiety and depression. And so stress is really this ability to cope with your life challenges. And there's a subtle balance. People say, oh, if only I had no stress at all. Well, no stress at all is not a good situation either. People need a challenge. If you invented a video game where where the players always won the game, it would be the biggest flop because there's no challenge. So there has to be a certain amount of challenge in life. Now the question is finding the balance between the amount of stress that you're coping with and your capability of coping with stress. Now, in many situations where people are not able to cope with their stress, the amount of stress they're dealing with exceeds their capability of coping with that amount of stress, that amount of challenge. So what you want to do, one obvious way, is to reduce the amount of stress. Now, for a single mother, there's nothing she can do. She has to raise the child, and she has to take care of that family. So, and as someone in a war situation in a country, there's no choice. I mean, that's what you're given. You are under that chronic stress, and you have to cope with it. There's no reducing the amount of stressor. So the only thing you really do in that situation is increase your capability of coping with that stress. And there's a term for this. It's called resilience. Your ability to be resilient, to overcome and adapt to those circumstances and those challenges and succeed. And yoga enhances that capability.
Wonderful, wonderful. And also, oftentimes we make decisions that put us in the situation in the first place. I'm not saying any specific situation, but another person in the same life path would have made different choices. And the way we make choices, again, as you said, the perceptions and everything, we make better choices. So we don't put ourselves in those situations that are beyond our capability. I'll give you an example. And I don't exactly remember the names and the details, so I might be wrong here. But I think the dean of Northwestern Business School, Kellogg, became the dean of INSEAD, which is the B school in France, one of the top ones. And then eventually, recently, or I don't know when exactly, but he resigned saying that I am experiencing overwhelming stress and I think it would be best to resign. Now, that doesn't happen very often that you come across a highly successful person in that situation. People will say, unless something extraordinary happened, this shouldn't be happening because you should have handled it better. I'm not questioning him. I have no idea. That's not what I'm saying. But
Right.
But what I'm trying to get at is that we put ourselves in certain situations, and sometimes it's just lack of knowledge or accident, but other times it's not. And another example is my older brother. He happens to be the head of research at a mutual fund company, And he one time in Houston, and he one time got a job offer as a managing director at Merrill Lynch in New York with a great raise and all great things. And I said, I call him by a certain term rather than by his name. I said, you have to jump at it. You can't be saying no to it. He says, I'll think about it. And then he comes back and says, no, I'm not taking it. And in retrospect, it was a very wise decision for many, many reasons. First of all, the financial crisis. And, he had a stable life. He chose to do whatever he did, and he's peaceful, happy. And if he had gone there, most likely he would have been in a very unhappy situation. Now, I wouldn't have possibly made a decision like him. I would have probably done the opposite. I am a different kind of person. I'm into skydiving. I'm into scuba diving. I put myself under a great amount of stress. My natural tendency, but I'm aware of what I'm doing. And still I choose to do that. That's, in fact, one time my parachute didn't open. Somebody else had to come on the other side and open my parachute in my diving experience. Yeah, that's I would say a very stressful situation. But my point is, the awareness is important. And yoga brings that awareness of...
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other thing about chronic stress is that if people are not coping with this stress, oftentimes people will have a dysfunctional response, a dysfunctional behavior, a counterproductive behavior to try and cope with their stress. And clear examples of this are, for example, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, eating junk food, staying up late at night, getting less sleep. And although these things seem to be sort of helping with the stress on the very, very short term, they are in fact impairing your ability to cope with stress. Because now you have an alcohol problem, and you have a smoking problem, and you have poor diet with poor nutrition, which affects not only the body but also the brain. So you're basically impairing your ability to cope with the stress by using these dysfunctional behaviors. And these are knee-jerk decisions that are made based upon their inability to cope with stress. And so basically, a mind-body practice like yoga will allow you to cope with the stress in the way that is appropriate for the stress, and really allowing you to manage not only what you have, but also giving you the resilience and the stress coping capacity to take on more.
Absolutely. And, these self-destructive behaviors manifest themselves in different ways in the office environment. You find executives yelling at employees, or if not yelling, they might engage in passive-aggressive behaviors. And they are all undermining the functions and the productivity of the organization. I mean, you can take down an organization like that. So
absolutely. And yoga fosters the ability to experience the positive emotions by removing the stress, by removing the negative emotions. What's left is the opportunity for the other parts of the emotional spectrum to engage, for positive emotions to appear. Compassion, for example, is a prime example. And it changes, over the long term, yoga practice changes one's perception of one's life and one's relationship to it. And let me explain a little bit how I conceptualize that. And this goes back to yoga's original role as a spiritual discipline. What happens when you practice these meditative attention techniques, the contemplative practices over time, is you start to activate areas of the brain that produce a deeper, more profound experience. And this can be a very, very short lasting experience. It can last just a few seconds, for example, during a yoga practice. But the profundity of this experience of unity and sort of a deeper state of consciousness is so profound that it actually changes one's attitude and one's view of the world. And people actually talk about, after a few months of yoga practice, they say, my life was changed, I was transformed. And they actually use that language of transformed. And I believe this contemplative state is really also associated with a lot of other positive psychological attributes. People make different choices. They change their worldview. This is critical. I mean, someone whose worldview is, my goal is to earn $1 billion. That's my goal in life. That's all I want. That's a very limited worldview. if one practices yoga and you experience these deeper states of consciousness, suddenly you realize the weakness of that worldview. And you start to appreciate a broader world, a broader perspective of who you are and what your relationship is to the rest of the universe. And that really is a fundamental change that people can go through when they practice contemplative practices over an extended period of time. And it leads to states of behavior that would do very well for our planet. I mean, if we had less aggression, less greed and capitalism, and more compassion, we would do a lot better as a society. And I think it starts with the individual. Yoga basically allows the individuals to do this transformation, to make this change. If the individuals in society change, the entire country is going to change as a consequence.
And for the benefit of the type A personality, I want to add here that, this is not counterindicative to making money. In fact, money follows. Most of the successful people, immensely successful people, including Bill Gates, have had that level of compassion, the drive for a cause. Even though they had aggression initially, they had the drive for a cause. They were not necessarily running after money. The money follows. In fact, I talked to a CEO of a Fortune 1000 company just some time back, Dr. Jack London, and he talks about character in general. And he talks about, no, I never set out to make money. Yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar company now, but that wasn't my goal. And I recommend to everybody that you do what is the right thing to do. Doesn't mean money will not follow. Nobody's saying that you don't have to go after money or enjoy the typical material success. In fact, they both can run in parallel, and they do run in parallel. Some of us may choose not to worry about that, who say, well, I'm not interested in the money, I'm interested in creating something else. I mean, you could be creating an organization, which a lot of people may not agree with. For example, Sri Ravi Shankar, he's created a great huge organization. I'm not going to say great because I don't know really what it is. And there is both pros and cons, but at least the success of creating an organization is there. And there are many others who have done great things. Mother Teresa did great things. Again, I'm not talking about these things per se to do. You can choose to do whatever you want. It is not against the idea of making you dulling your type A personality. That's not the idea, but you will recognize that whatever succeeds with type A personality will still help you succeed. You will get rid of the rough edges and become a better person, more peaceful to others. But at the same time, that does not neuter you.
Yes, no, I fully agree with that. In fact, I would take it a step even further. I would say that for people who undervalue money, a yoga practice may well bring those people into a proper understanding of the need for money. And there's a lot of husbands who just don't provide well for their families, and that kind of change is necessary. On the other hand, you have people who are a little bit overly concerned with money. And yoga practice may well bring them back to a more balanced view of having what they need, and they don't really need any more, and that's what they really need and want in life. And ultimately, the whole idea of making money for many people is this idea of happiness. And that's what people really want. They want to be happy. They want to be prosperous. They don't want to suffer. As long as you make enough money to make that happen, that's really what people need. In fact, this whole idea of the more money you make, the happier you are is well known to be a falsity. In fact, many of the richest people in the world are miserable. Despite the fact that they have all of this money, simply because they still have their brain and their emotions the way they are, and they're dysfunctional. They may have a lot of money, but that doesn't give you happiness.
I'll give you a perfect example of that. In fact, it happened in Germany some years back. A 75-year-old man who lost, I think, 8 billion or 40 billion. I don't know how much he lost, but he still had about 8 to 10 billion dollars. 75 years old, stands in front of a running train and kills himself. I don't know if people can understand the irony of it, but I think people should think about it a little bit. The mental state of a human being of that kind. How deluded do you have to be to do that?
Well, it all comes from this inability of human beings to be able to cope with cope with life, and cope with stress and emotion. And in a sense, it's not surprising because our culture and our society don't have this skill. Our schools do not have this skill. If you go to a public school anywhere in the world, you'll get trained in the languages, you'll get trained in mathematics, you'll get trained in geography and history, but you will not get trained in emotion regulation and stress management, simply because we don't have that skill as part of our society. And yoga and mind-body practices are exactly that kind of skill. And without that kind of skill, you are at risk for developing these severe problems. Mental health problems, stress-induced diseases, and impaired quality of life.
And to talk in the Western scientific accepted practices, EQ has been shown lately to be the most important factor for success. And what we're talking about essentially is EQ, emotional quotient. And if it helps you improve your EQ, which has been shown that IQ cannot be changed, well, there may be some debate there, but fundamentally you can't make much of a difference in your IQ, but you can change your EQ humongously if you want to through yoga. And there have been lots of examples as well as research that shows, EQ can be improved. And if that is the case, then why wouldn't anyone want to do that? So Dr. Khalsa, I am so happy that I got this opportunity to talk with you, learn some great stuff. We had a wonderful conversation, and I want to thank you for that.
I was very grateful to you for having me on. Thank you.